So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us. Today, we are going to listen to our third public lecture of our series where we host our UNESCO Fellow and Global Fellows. Today, we are listening to Temenuga Trifonova. She is one of our two global fellows. The fellowship is made possible by Stiftung Sparkasse, which gave the funding and the patronage. Unfortunately, the president of the Sparkasse couldn't join us today, but they would like to extend our fellows and our audience the best greetings. Also, our director, Professor Peklaner, today cannot be with us. But is very sorry and sends greetings. So I will coordinate today's meeting, and I would say that we will start the presentation in 1 minute. I will just briefly introduce our speaker. Temenuga is Associate Professor of Creative Arts and Humanities at University College of London, where she just moved from Canada. And she's the author of several publications on cinema and the theory of cinema. For instance, the last monography is The Figure of the Migrant in Contemporary European Cinema. She looks at topical issues, trying to go in depth with the theoretical analysis, and also considering the shifting imaginaries and cultural scenarios that characterize our societies. He has also edited some books on contemporary visual culture and the sublime and screening the art world. And she's been recipient of different fellowships in Paris, Tokyo, New York, Rome, and Bologna. So this is just a small part of her impressive curriculum, but I think you got the idea that we have a real expert of contemporary cinema and of the theory of cinema. So today she will speak about the topic Visions of Neoliberal Europe, Fragmented Struggle and Ethical Dilemmas in Contemporary European Cinema. Thank you very much, Temenuga, for accepting this fellowship, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for this very kind introduction, and I'll just jump straight into it. And unfortunately, I'll have to go back and forth between the presentation and my paper, so it will be a little bit awkward. So my presentation is called Visions of Neoliberal Europe, Fragmented Struggle and Ethical Dilemmas in Contemporary European Cinema. And I'll try to keep it not heavy on theory, because I know that most people are not really specialists in that area.
Sorry, Temenuga, just to tell you, if you want us to see the presentation, you should share the screen.
Oh, you cannot see it right now?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, hold on. Can you see it now?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and forth between all this. So here I've just posted William Davis's kind of division of neoliberalism in several different stages. I'm not going to go through them, but hold on. So how do I get out of this mode now? Shit.
Temenuga?
Yeah.
Sorry for disturbing. If you are okay with that, we will show the presentation so that you can keep everything on your desktop, okay?
Do you have the presentation?
Yes, it arrived.
Oh.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So now we are on this slide. This is the first slide, right? Yeah. Understood as a, oops, I cannot see my stuff.
Yes, this is Chiara keeping control. In a moment, so you can go on.
Slide, yeah. Understood as a political epistemological program rather than simply free market fundamentalism, as a particular production of subjectivity that constitutes individual subjects as human capital, rather than simply a way of governing economies or states, neoliberalism has led to the profound destruction of social bonds and to the production of economic, social, and political vulnerability and precarity. Originally signifying a social condition linked to poverty, precarity refers to the rise in flexible and precarious forms of labor, the growth of the knowledge economy, the reduction of welfare state provisions, the suppression of unions, and the association of migration with illegality. While many scholars trace the emergence of precarity as a concept of socioeconomic struggle to the late 1990s anti-globalization protests in Seattle and Genoa, driven by nostalgia and anger towards the disappearance of Fordism, others remind us that the main reason precarity has received increased attention is that its distribution has come to affect the once privileged subject of both capitalist production and colonial extraction, the middle-class white male. While precariousness constitutes a shared condition that makes human bodies dependent on social and political infrastructures, precarity is the effect of social and political apparatuses that seek to compensate for precariousness by distributing its effects unequally. Slide. Make sure that it's. Can you move to the next slide, please? Can you hear me?
I'll check.
Can we go to the next slide? Sorry, I thought you were doing the slides now. No? Can you move to the next slide? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, Temenuga, sorry, there's a technical problem and Chiara is trying to solve this.
Oh.
But we will keep up with you as soon as the presentation collaborates. So you go on and the slides will arrive.
Okay. So the next slide was kind of a slide from Guy Standing's book, The New Dangerous Class, The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class. The term precariat was popularized by Guy Standing, who argued that the restructuring of global and national economies in the last 40 years has produced a new global class characterized by chronic insecurity. Standing considers the precariat a class in the making rather than a class in the Marxist sense, and emphasizes the precariat's limited possibilities for organized struggle. Over the last 2 decades, studies exploring neoliberalism, precarity, labor, and class in cinema have proliferated. And here I was supposed to go to the next 2 slides to give you some examples of recent studies. These studies adopt a comparative approach to uncover similarities and differences in the iconography of precarity across national cinemas. Some of the subjects they explore include precarious labor, downward mobility, the gendering of precarity and intersectional struggles, the social invisibility of the precariat, individual refusal and collective agency, and so on. And here there was supposed to be another slide with just some examples of, again, studies on precarity and cinema. Precarity extends beyond the expression of an economic condition to indicate an entire affective environment, a sense of individualized insecurity, and the loss of social and existential status. Consider, for example, Siang Gai's book, Ugly Feelings, in which she discusses envy, anxiety, irritation, paranoia, and resentment as the representative affects of late modernity, or Guy Standing's emphasis on the precariat's anger, anxiety, anomie, and alienation in his book, The Precariat, The New Dangerous Class, and Lauren Berlant's analysis of post-Fordist affect, the affective language of anxiety, contingency, and precarity in her book, Cruel Optimism. Berlant traced the shift in the meaning of precarity from limited structure to pervasive life environment to the period of neoliberal restructuring in the guise of flexible labor from the 1980s onwards, and identifies an emergent aesthetics that she calls the cinema of precarity. Featuring characters cut off from futurity and often articulating impasse, the cinema of precarity explores social problems like unemployment, labor unrest, class conflicts, and our various adjustment strategies, to use Berlant's term, to neoliberalism's extension of economic logic to non-economic areas of life. The next slide, that I don't know if you can see right now, lists some of the historical predecessors or precursors of the cinema of precarity. Unlike its predecessors, the new European cinema of precarity is distinguished by a wide range of genres and styles, traditional social realism being no longer sufficient to capture Europe's political, economic, and moral crisis. And the next several slides had basically images of different films that I consider representative of the cinema of precarity. So the cinema of precarity, as I said, is very varied in terms of genres and styles. It includes allegorical and magical realist films like Happy as Lazaro, Transit, experimental films like Bait, black comedies like Glory, My Piece of the Pie, Crash Test, Aglaé, social dramas like The Measure of a Man and At War, psychological thrillers like Early One Morning, The Origin of Evil, factory musicals like The Nothing Factory, and many, many more. I will now look at a small sample of representative films to make 4 interrelated claims. And these were on my next slide, the 4 claims. 1, the cinema of precarity depicts precarity as an experience shared by very different subjects, urging us to imagine potential conditions of solidarity among individuals without a shared identity or history. 2, the cinema of precarity registers the disintegration of working class identity and a declining sense of class solidarity. In the absence of radical universalizing discourses of class-based struggle and traditional leftist political alternatives, the cinema of precarity focuses on individual protagonists struggling on their own and is often unable to envision new forms of collective struggle. 3, inasmuch as it focuses on individual protagonists and their struggles, the cinema of precarity tends to reframe class struggle in ethical or moral terms. 4, the cinema of precarity is stylistically and generically diverse. In other words, it goes beyond the familiar conventions of social realism. And now I'm going to talk about each of these 4 claims. So number 1, imagining potential conditions of solidarity among individuals without a shared identity or history. A growing number of studies invite us to see precarity as a political tool rather than a socioeconomic condition from which there is no escape, trying to envision new forms of solidarity and collectivity, as Martin O'Shaughnessy, for example, does in his book Looking Beyond Neoliberalism, or Francesco Sticchi does in his book Mapping Precarity in Contemporary Cinema and Television, as well as Maria Stelle and Beverly Weber in their recent book Precarious Intimacies, The Politics of Touch in Contemporary Western European Cinema, which probes the tension between the experience of political and economic vulnerability depicted in contemporary European films and the precarious intimacies and lines of solidarity that arise out of such vulnerability. This is now the next slide. Let me provide my own examples. And the next slide basically was a slide including movie posters of different films that I'm going to talk about, which are Princesses, Fernando León de Aranoa, It's a Free World, Ken Loach, Amador, again León de Aranoa, La Nostra Vita, Daniele Lucchetti, Shanley and the Poet, Andrea Segre, Terra Firma, My Piece of the Pie, and many others. I'm not going to list all the titles. So films like these foreground the structural and affective affinities between disenfranchised European citizens, non-citizens, and non-Europeans, inviting us to envision new conditions of solidarity between individuals without a shared identity or history. For example, Princesses explores transnational reciprocity and female solidarity between Spanish working girls and Dominican immigrants through the relationship between a middle-class Spanish woman and a Dominican sex worker. Amador, another film, focuses on the friendship between a precarious Bolivian illegal immigrant, Marcela, the middle-class Spanish man for whom she is a caretaker, and a precarious Andalusian neighbor and sex worker. It's a Free World by Ken Loach centers on a working-class British woman who, after losing her job, sets up her own recruitment agency through which she hires illegal workers from Eastern Europe. La Nostra Vita follows Claudio, who, following the unexpected death of his wife in childbirth, negotiates a deal with his boss to give him his own construction site to supervise, in exchange for which he promises not to report the death of an illegal Romanian worker that his boss is covering up. Claudio's site workers, mostly illegal migrants, eventually quit when Claudio finds himself unable to pay them. The film depicts the Italian working class as sharing the same precarious existence as that of immigrants, both legal and illegal. Mediterranea, yet another film, traces the friendship between an illegal migrant from Burkina Faso working as an orange picker in Italy and Pio, an Italian Romani boy of lower class origins, again a relationship of solidarity rooted in their shared socioeconomic disenfranchisement. Terra Firma, another Italian film, examines the affinities between a family of fishermen in Lampedusa and a group of African refugees. Twin Flower, yet another Italian film set in Sardinia, follows the romance between two teenagers on the run, a girl running away from the human trafficker for whom her father used to work, and a refugee from Côte d'Ivoire. The film draws a parallel between the experience of refugees and various socially disenfranchised Italians, including sex workers, beggars, and human traffickers. The French film My Piece of the Pie draws a similar parallel between the precarious existence of a French woman, a single mother named France, recently laid off, and migrant workers, one of whom finds France a job on the condition that France speak with a foreign accent since the job is meant for migrants. The Swedish film Eat, Sleep, Die paints a realistic picture of the equally precarious existence of working class Swedes and migrants, both laid off from the factory where they all work. And finally, Cover Boy, another Italian film, centers on the friendship between a young Romanian man who travels to Rome in search of work and a 40-year-old Italian man looking as a cleaner at Termini station. Next, I'm going to go to my second point, second claim, from collective to individual struggle, the declining sense of class identity and solidarity. Contemporary European films reflect a declining sense of working class unity and purpose. And here there was a slide. If we look at British cinema, for example, and the slide basically was just movie posters of different British recent films. If we look at British cinema, for example, we see that not only do most recent British films focus on individual protagonists, but they also displace issues of class consciousness and class struggle onto questions of national identity, rising populism, and anti-immigrant attitudes, as is the case in the film This Is England, or globalization in It's a Free World, gender relations and female empowerment in Fish Tank, civil and human rights in I, Daniel Blake, and neoliberal restructuring and the gig economy in Sorry, We Missed You. Failing to imagine an alternative to the existing order and usually ending in disillusionment, metaphorical suicide, or death, the films reflect the shrinking of political horizons. Even the most recent films of a committed left-wing filmmaker like Ken Loach, I, Daniel Blake, 2016, and Sorry, We Missed You, 2019, failed to envision new forms of collective struggle. While the film I, Daniel Blake was mostly positively received, some called it misery porn for smug Londoners. After suffering, this is a short kind of plot summary, after suffering a heart attack at work, Daniel is instructed by doctors to rest. Since he doesn't have the requisite number of points to be deemed eligible for employment and support allowance, he must apply for job seekers allowance and continue looking for jobs that he cannot actually take because of his condition. When the absurdity of his predicament drives him to defiantly spray paint the walls of the benefits center, Daniel is arrested. Far from offering a coherent vision of collective struggle, the film depicts revolt in the shape of individual gestures of kindness and solidarity that cut across racial and gender boundaries, from Daniel's moments of camaraderie with his neighbor China, a young Black man, with a sympathetic job center employee, and also with the precariously employed single mother Katie. However, the film fails to challenge conventional narratives of the gendering of precarity. Daniel's relationship with Katie, for example, establishes him as a protective male figure, while Katie, the single precariously employed mother, is presented with typically gendered alternatives to precarity, sex work. Daniel's revolt does not challenge the system, but only its inefficiency. It is a personal struggle to preserve his integrity and self-respect, rather than a collective struggle targeting an inherently unjust social and political system. His autograph beneath his spray-painted revolt reads, I, Daniel Blake, not we, Daniel Blake. Recent French films also focus on individual protagonists disengaged from collective struggle. And here there was a slide with some images from the next film I'm going to talk about. Eric Gravel's film Crash Test Aglaé, 2017, tells the story of a young socially awkward woman, Aglaé, working in a car crash test laboratory. When the company suddenly moves the entire factory offshore, she decides to follow her job to Calcutta, India, rather than face the prospect of redundancy. Although the film starts out as an industrial action story, as soon as Aglaé hits the road, her story is reframed as a personal, individual quest. Her self-emancipation from a work slave to an independent young woman comes at the cost of class emancipation. Her absurd journey to India becomes an instant media sensation and forces the Swiss owner of the factory where she used to work to rethink offshoring and to actually offer Aglaé a job back. Oops. Invited to give a press conference for the sake of her co-workers in France, for whom she has become a symbol of class struggle, Aglaé refuses, choosing instead to stay in India, where she says she feels more herself. The film's critique of offshoring as a principle of global neoliberal capitalism eventually devolves into an acceptance of the neoliberal discourse of precarity as an opportunity to find oneself or reinvent oneself. And here there was another slide with images from the next film that I'm going to talk about, also by the same director, Eric Gravel. With a propulsive editing style and an ominous electronic score, the film Full Time, 2021, follows Julie, a 40-ish single mother living in the suburbs of Paris, from the moment when she gets her kids ready for school, through her long commute to Paris, interrupted by transport strikes, to her evening journey back home, which depends on replacement bus services and hitched rides. In the absence of any safety nets, Julie is dependent on a precarious support network. An elderly neighbor is reluctantly minding her kids. Her co-workers occasionally cover for her, but only when it suits them. Strangers give her rides to Paris when she needs to go to work. The film foregrounds the difficulty of precarious subjects to organize themselves politically. It's not an accident that the event that keeps disrupting Julie's daily commute to her work and her attempts to secure a full-time job is a transit strike, which she supports, but in which she cannot afford to participate simply because she has no time. All she can do is look for partial individual solutions to her own problems. And here there is another slide to the next film that I'm going to discuss, another French film called, in English, Zero Fucks Given, 2021. The first half of Zero Fucks Given, which centers on Cassandra, a flight attendant for a low-cost European airline company, is shot in cinema verite style, featuring real flight attendants. The combination of dynamic editing, impressionistic shots framed in a quasi-home movie style, and a soundtrack that alternates between elevator music and Eurotrash hits captures the repetitive, disorienting existence of flight attendants and precarious workers more generally. Like Julie in the previous film, Cassandra is suspended in a perpetual scavenging present, unable to project herself either in the past and thus unable to find solace or inspiration in historical revolutionary struggles and in a shared sense of working class identity, or in the future by envisioning a different order of things. In one scene, the flight attendants are invited by striking airport employees to join their fight for better pay and working conditions, but the flight attendants are too busy working to think about the future. I don't even know if I will be alive tomorrow, Cassandra laughs as she runs to catch her next flight. While the film dramatizes the production of neoliberal subjectivity through rhetoric, training, surveillance, and self-surveillance, like the previous film by the same director, Crash Test Aglaé, it filters its potential critique of precarious work through the protagonist's personal trauma, when, in a moment of drunken stupor, Cassandra tells another flight attendant that her mother died a few years ago in a tragic car accident. Cassandra, we're meant to understand, has freely chosen the exploitative, emotionally destructive, and precarious work for a low-cost airline as a way of dealing with personal trauma. Going on to the next claim, number 3. Here there was another slide again with some images of the different films that I'm going to talk about. In the absence of universalizing political ideals, the cinema of precarity often frames class conflicts and class struggle in terms of moral or ethical dilemmas, which seem to provide the only universal framework within which we can envision possible alternatives to neoliberalism. In many of these films, the price one has to pay to stay financially afloat is repeatedly framed in ethical or moral terms. For example, in Catherine Corsini's film, 3 Worlds, the protagonist accidentally kills an illegal Moldovan immigrant and has to cover up his death if he wants to get the promotion he has been working for all his life. In the film The Measure of a Man, a recently unemployed man lands a job as a security guard in a supermarket where he's forced to spy on his co-workers, one of whom commits suicide after she's caught stealing. In the Portuguese film Saint Jorge, an unemployed factory worker and boxer struggling to keep his Brazilian wife and son from leaving Portugal is forced to become a debt collector and intimidate his fellow countrymen who have defaulted on their loans. The Italian film Human Capital by Paolo Virzi also displaces questions of class and structural injustices onto ethical questions about the value of human life and what constitutes human integrity. The film begins with a hit-and-run accident. A waiter riding his bicycle home gets run off the road by an SUV that flees the scene of the crime. After the crash, the film flashes back 6 months and shows the events leading up to the crash from 3 different perspectives, introducing us to a wealthy hedge fund manager, his wife, their teenage son, who might or might not have been driving the car, his girlfriend, and her father, a small-time real estate agent with ambitions to climb up the social ladder. The film's title refers to the insurance industry's term determining the worth of a human life when negotiating a settlement, a formula based on the person's age at the time of death, their earning capacity, the quantity and quality of their emotional bonds, in other words, their human capital. Another example, Massimo Venier's film Generazione 1000 Euro, 2009, in which Matteo, a math graduate, is forced to accept a job in the marketing office of a telecommunications company, which is about to cut back on personnel. Matteo is faced with an ethical choice between moral integrity and capitalist profit, between remaining precarious but preserving his humanity and integrity as a person, friend, and romantic partner, and climbing up the social and career ladder by accepting a lucrative job in Barcelona that his seductive female boss offers him. In another Italian film, I Can Quit Whenever I Want, this film could be seen as a sequel to Generazione 1000 Euros, finding the characters of the earlier film later in their lives, now in their early 30s, and working manual jobs for which they're overqualified. The story follows Pietro, a brilliant molecular biologist who fails to secure a permanent university contract. Unable to break the news to his girlfriend and skeptical about the usefulness of participating in yet another protest of university adjuncts in front of Parliament, Pietro stumbles upon a brilliant scheme of making a new recreational drug and selling it in nightclubs, and puts together a team of former university friends who are all unemployed or forced into badly paid manual jobs. After allowing himself to be seduced by the high life of a successful drug dealer, Pietro is arrested and sentenced to a year in prison. What matters most, the film suggests, as do all the other films that I mentioned before, is that Pietro remained a good guy and a reliable partner and future father, that he doesn't sell out, that he remained precarious, but at least, preserves his ethical integrity. And my last point, the poetics of the new European cinema of precarity beyond social realism. The expository, often didactic approach to social issues has always been a hallmark of social realism. However, unlike previous film styles or movements of committed cinema, which generally follow the conventions of social realism, the cinema of precarity is stylistically and generically diverse, from psychological thrillers through comedies to crime films, and increasingly transcends the limits of social realism. This is especially visible in British cinema, which used to be virtually synonymous with social realism. And here there was another slide. While British filmmakers continue to explore pressing social issues, they do so in a much more self-conscious and often intimate way than Ken Loach's brand of social realism. For example, by moving towards a hybrid of art cinema and socio-political commentary, as Shane Meadows does in the film 24/7, or commenting on the medium of film itself, as Mark Jenkins does in the film Bait, or exploring the intermediate relation between film and the other visual arts, as Richard Billingham does in his film Ray and Liz. Many European migrant films try to dramatize the experience of migrants or refugees by implicitly structuring their stories as responses to the question, how far would migrants and refugees go to make it to Fortress Europe? Similarly, when the cinema of precarity enters genre territory, it often borrows the elimination logic of reality shows like Survivor and Squid Game, which divide the world into winners and losers. And so these films ask, how far would one go to win or simply to survive? Unsurprisingly, mental breakdown, suicide, and murder, or both suicide and murder, both among blue-collar and white-collar workers, feature with increasing regularity in the cinema of precarity. Some examples include Mrs. Anselmi's suicide in the film Measure of a Man, Vincent's symbolic suicide in the film Time Out, Gregoire's suicide in the film The Father of My Children, Laurent's suicide in the film At War. Some other examples, for example, in Francesco Comencini's I Like to Work, Mi Piace Lavorare, a firm tries to force a woman to resign from her job by using increasingly humiliating tactics that push her to the edge of a mental breakdown. In The Father of My Children, by Mia Hansen-Love, a French film producer who has his own film company learns that he's 4 million euros in debt and that his catalog of films, already mortgaged, is only worth less than $1 million. After he commits suicide, his wife tries and fails to honor his memory by completing the work still in production. In Early One Morning, another French film, Paul, a senior executive at an investment bank, arrives in the office, takes out a gun, shoots his boss and another employee, locks himself in his office, and as he waits for the police, reflects on the events leading up to this day, starting with the arrival of his new ruthless boss, under whom Paul increasingly finds himself sidelined and eventually made redundant because of his poor metrics. In Heartbeat Detector, another French film, Kessler, a psychologist employed by a company to evaluate the mental health of its employees and advise on firings and hirings, uncovers disturbing connections between the workings of the corporation and the Holocaust, as a result of which his perception of reality becomes skewed. Against this morbid background of suicides and murders, the unreliable narrator and the femme fatale, staples of film noir, have recently resurfaced in thrillers centered on precarious female characters. And here there was another slide. Unlike the female protagonists of films like Silvio Soldini's Days and Clouds, 2007, and Paolo Virzi's Tutta la vita davanti, Your Whole Life Ahead of You, who are depicted as resourceful and capable of adapting to their precarious circumstances, in contrast to the men around them who tragically failed to adapt, the female protagonists of more recent films, like the French films Faultless, 2016, and The Origin of Evil, 2022, are equally, if not more resourceful than the female protagonists of these previous two films that I mentioned. However, their adaptation strategies, to use Lauren Berlant's term, push them closer and closer to the verge of a psychotic break. Here there was another slide. Faultless, so I'm going to finish by talking about these two films by Sébastien Marnier. Faultless, which mixes elements of the crime film, psychological thriller, and film noir, follows 40-year-old Constance, who, after losing her job as a real estate agent in Paris, returns to her hometown in rural France, hoping to get a job at the small real estate company where she used to work before moving to Paris. However, her former boss hires a younger woman, Audrey, who is willing to work for less than a living wage. Constance becomes obsessed with the idea of getting rid of her rival. She begins stalking Audrey, posing as an apartment hunter under an assumed name to infiltrate her life. The film was generally received as a psychological thriller about a sociopath intent on getting her job back, no matter what it takes. What I think is most important about the film, however, is the way it depicts precarity as indicating an entire affective environment rather than merely an economic condition. Constance's obsession with getting a job is not merely motivated by the pressing need for money, although she does need money, but by a deeper psychological need, which the opening scene hints at. In the opening scene, Constance wakes up from a nap in her Paris apartment and lights a cigarette, but is interrupted rudely by a real estate agent who is showing the apartment to a young couple, something that she was not even aware that the apartment was up for sale. Constance quickly comes up with an excuse, collects her belongings in a small suitcase, and leaves. It is this painful sense of shame and failure that motivates her subsequent actions. Unable to actively change her circumstances, the only way she can exercise any form of agency is in the form of verbal persuasion, as when she tries to convince Audrey, her rival, to leave her job and join her fiancé in Russia, and pranks. For example, she deletes appointments from Audrey's agenda, turns off the power in her house so that Audrey doesn't hear her alarm clock and is late for work, all with the intention of getting her job back from Audrey. There is a long history of pranks as political tactics. The Situationists were particularly fond of them, for example. Constance's pranks, however, are not so much a form of resistance as an indication of her loss of agency, which she desperately tries to reclaim by literally trying to be Audrey. She breaks into Audrey's house, lounges in her bedroom, eats her food, showers in her bathroom, sleeps in her bed. Finally, Nathalie, and here there was another slide, the protagonist of Marnier's next film, The Origin of Evil, released only last year, also tries to reclaim her sense of agency by literally assuming the identity of the person she wants to be. The pitch for the film, a woman on the verge of financial collapse attempts to reconnect with her wealthy, estranged father and his new family, seems straightforward enough. However, nothing about the story is straightforward. Some critics called the film an homage to Patricia Highsmith's book and film, The Talented Mr. Ripley, with echoes of Agatha Christie. I would argue, however, and here there was another slide, that the obvious predecessor to Nathalie and Constance and their die-hard investment in the fantasy of the good life, to use Lauren Berlant's term, is Rosetta from the Dardenne brothers film 1999, also called Rosetta, though there are important differences between these three female characters. In Rosetta, the Dardenne brothers film, a teenager living with her alcoholic mother in a caravan park makes numerous attempts to secure a stable job. 25 years later, Nathalie, the protagonist of The Origin of Evil, and Constance, the protagonist of Faultless, both middle-aged, are equally deprived of a support network. And Nathalie's barely making ends meet as a worker in a fish canning factory and living out of a suitcase. But if Rosetta's cruel optimism manifested itself in her determination to secure a job at any cost, Nathalie's adaptation strategy is to succumb fully to the fantasy of the good life, ultimately believing that she really is the wealthy Serge's real daughter, whose identity she has assumed, just as Constance in Faultless tries to assume Audrey's identity. Natalie takes a huge risk, but there is nothing revolutionary about her project of infiltrating Serge's wealthy family. She has no intention of challenging the system of social relations that upholds the class inequalities that produce precarity. The film is also radically opposed in terms of genre and style. Rosetta is a social drama shot in a neorealist style, episodic in structure, centered on character rather than plot, with attention to the details of everyday life. On the other hand, Faultless in The Origin of Evil are thrillers filled with many plot twists and revelations. Rosetta is a supremely ethical character who, driven by circumstances and by despair, does the unthinkable. She betrays the very person who helps her get a job in order to obtain his job, but then suffers the moral consequences. She quits her job, the job that she stole from her friend, and tries to commit suicide. In the more recent films, however, Faultless and The Origin of Evil, such ethical questions and internal psychological conflicts are replaced simply by plot questions. Will Nathalie and Constance get away with it? Will they win or lose? Indicating the growing impotence of the political imagination. And here I will stop.
Thank you very much.
I wasn't following. Were you able to go through the slides? I was not really.
Yes.
Oh, you
we
were.
Clara was following you. So thanks a lot for your rich presentation. I think we have a lot of information now, and I see that it's raining questions for you. So I will quickly read them, and I would ask you please to be quite concise in the answers so that we can read several questions. So first, Ismaila wrote that you showed films that depict the struggles faced by individuals in the precariat, highlighting the instability, lack of security, and limited access to social protections. These interconnected aspects show the difficulties faced by people and communities under neoliberal policies. Are there any specific challenges faced by films that tackle the vision of neoliberal Europe compared to other types of films? But to this, Temenuga, if you agree, I would add also Alex's question, which is linked to Ismaila's. He asks, what's your take on the limitations of cinema in depicting precarity and ethical dilemmas? Is there something that can precisely not be communicated through cinema? And is there something that works exceptionally well using this format? Thank you, Temenuga.
Yeah, let me just go back and reread the questions. Are there any specific challenges traced by the films that tackle the vision of neoliberal Europe compared to other types of films? Well, I started out the presentation by saying that in terms of, I'm not sure what you mean by challenges in this question. Yeah, I guess you are right that it relates to Alex's question in the sense that, yeah, what can cinema, I mean, this is a more general question, what can cinema show and what cannot be shown? Obviously, on one hand, cinema is very good at showing like the daily struggle, I guess, of characters in precarious circumstances. So you can really identify with the character and be in their subjective point of view and understand, you know, what they're experiencing on a kind of affective level and also, I guess, economic level. But it cannot really, one of the challenges and I guess critiques of cinema more generally, not just of what I call the cinema or what others refer to the cinema as precarity, is that the cinema cannot really visualize all of these structural injustices that are leading to these very particular subjective experiences that we can get to identify with and understand. So we can identify with the characters, but we don't necessarily see the workings of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism, I mean, I don't even want to start to define the term. I tried to in the beginning, I think, but it's such a huge concept that critics cannot even agree on a definition of neoliberalism, let alone try to visualize that for the general public, you know, all the political, social, economic, cultural aspects of that concept and the historical reasons that have led to where we are now. Obviously, if you try to do that, that will be a totally different kind of film, a documentary, let's say, or an essay film. But the point of the narrative film, since I'm talking mostly about fictional films, I'm not talking about documentaries or essay films or any other kind of genre, the point, and this, like I said before, has been a general critique of films that depict those kinds of experiences is that they focus on, by definition, if you social realism or any kind of realist films focuses more on individual protagonists and their individual experiences. So what is the revolutionary potential here of, I mean, you can identify with the individual protagonists, understand their struggle, and then what? So yeah, one challenge, I guess, is depicting the collective experiences of many people rather than focusing on individual protagonists, because the filmmaker always has to decide, do I want the audience to really identify with the character, in which case you have to kind of use the character as a representative of a larger class and focus on the subjective experience of one individual person, or do I want to, it will be a completely different type of film if I want to depict, you know, as I said before, the historical reasons and what has happened over the last 40 years and so on. But like I said before, the other aspect of this question is that unlike previous films of committed cinema or social realist films, the contemporary cinema of precarity is much more diverse stylistically and in terms of genre. So I guess that's one way to reach a wider audience, I would say, because it's not, there is a special audience that goes to see, you know, social realist cinema, whereas people in general enjoy psychological, like the general audience enjoys more genre cinema, like Hollywood type films. So this turn towards other genres, I don't know if it's the only reason for that, to reach a wider audience, but also makes it much more difficult to talk about the cinema of precarity as a particular type of film or genre, because it infiltrates all kinds of films. It's not just one certain group that is easily identifiable and examinable. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer. Then Christoph writes in the chat, is precarity in a European film currently addressed more through realist or naturalist images or representations, for instance, as in Ken Loach, or does it rather amount to ideological critique, for instance, through satire, as in the film Triangle of Sadness or Tony Erdmann? Christoph also has a second question, which is related. He asks whether films can have a subversive effect, or does it rather have the opposite effect? Does it rather commodifies subversive elements and thus makes them consumable or enjoyable? So he's referring to what Brecht wanted to avoid through the distancing effect. So huge questions for you, Temenuga.
Yeah, that's a huge question. I don't know. I would have to really think more about it. But all of these questions, as I said before in my previous answer, relate not just to this particular type of films, but also can be asked about cinema in generally. And that's, I mean, a whole other topic. Like, I cannot really answer it concisely, because the question of, you know, whether cinema, for what purpose does cinema serve? And this is a larger question that you can ask in relationship to any kind of art form. Is it to, what is its revolutionary or democratic potential versus what is its ideological potential? And obviously in the history, if you look at the history of cinema, it has been used for both. And so in terms of the cinema of precarity, is it, well, the first part of the question, I mean, I already kind of answered that, because I said that the cinema of precarity is becoming more and more stylistically diverse, and it goes beyond what we used to think of in terms of socially committed cinema, so naturalism or social realism, to other genres, to explore other different genres. And does it amount to ideological critique? Well, it depends on the film. I cannot make blanket statements about, you know, all of cinema precarity is naturalistic or realistic, or all the cinema precarity is ideologically suspect. It depends on the particular film. I haven't seen The Triangle of Sadness, but I did see Tony Erdmann, which I loved. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if satire should be, because this question, the way it's phrased, implies that satire has a kind of a privileged place in relationship to other genres, and I'm a little bit wary of saying that we have to give it this special status as if it's a film is satirical, that it's more ideologically subversive. In fact, from what I've read, I haven't seen Triangle of Sadness, but the reviews that I kind of skimmed or read was saying that it was precisely did what the second part of the question does. It commodifies the subversive elements. unlike the previous film by that director, The Square, which was also a satire, and I think it was a more successful satire than The Triangle of Sadness. But yeah, I can't really give a precise answer because it will take too long time, and because, like I said, I cannot say that certain genres or types of films are more ideologically progressive, more progressive or revolutionary than others. You cannot map, ideology across specific genres. Any film can be ideologically suspect, and any film can be potentially revolutionary. Because the question is, that also raises a larger question of the intentionality of the filmmaker, but also the role of the spectator. Because even if a film was intended in a specific way, as any kind of artwork, it can be received in a much different light. So I don't know.
Thank you, Temenuga. I think the answer is very clear, and maybe this can be one of the hints to be investigated or reflected upon during one of our next meetings. Since we are closing at 2 p.m. Italian time, I go to read the last questions. And I see Roland, our vice head, wrote too. So he's interested in the findings and conclusions of your analysis of European cinema. He asks what is satisfying, what not, regarding, of course, this issue of representing precarity, and what has to be improved in the contemporary European scenery of imaginal politics. Does film theory provide some answers, as, for example, Chiara Bottigli's work on imaginal politics? There's also a second question, which is more on the theoretical underpinnings of your theory. It says, you seem to strongly relate to traditional Marxist notions of class struggle, and you criticize their absence in the more privatized and individualized habits of contemporary filmmakers. Roland wonders whether aspects of this, including some examples, such as, for example, flight attendants, might soon be outdated, since experts predict that artificial intelligence, blockchain, and automation may take over, according to estimations of the World Economic Forum. 400 million jobs by 2030 will be lost. So again, don't you expect this to have an impact at all? 1 million euros question for you.
Yeah, I'm not even finished. This will take a lot of time to digest. I'm going to the beginning of the question. What is satisfying and what not? Well, what has to be improved? Well, I don't really like to, not the type of person who would say, pat the filmmaker on the shoulder and say, oh, you should improve, and next film should do this or should that. What is satisfying and what not? Well, I think I started the first question that I answered was kind of my answer to this question. What I find satisfying is the way that these films can make us identify with the protagonists and understand their struggles on a purely phenomenological level. But what is not is kind of linked to the second part of the question, is that that all these films, like I said, kind of try to imagine these subtle lines of solidarity between the cross gender, race, and other and nationality and other boundaries, which I guess is a positive thing that these films do, but do not really provide us with any clear notion or imagination of what is the image of collective struggle in the future. Like how can things change? Like how can, not in a very kind of instrumentalist fashion, this is what should happen. Obviously, we don't expect that from a film, but the question of imagination is important. I mean, like I said, the films seem to stop at, kind of making us visualize and understand and empathize with the characters and what they're experiencing. And then what is the next point after that? How can we imagine all of these people? We see the similarities between these different characters' experiences, but what can be done to unite these characters and to unite these people with very different experiences and oftentimes not shared identities and historical and social positions, like one of my points that I elaborated on. But how can these people unite, and kind of how can we change the current situation? And this is actually one of the critiques of Guy Standing. I studied with Guy Standing's ideas on the precariat from his book, The Dangerous Class, The Precariat, The Dangerous Class, in which one of my first slides was kind of a list of different classes in late capitalist modernity, according to Guy Standing, and how they differ from the previous class division, in the typical Marxist sense. And one of the criticisms of Guy Standing's work has been precisely that, yeah, he's very clear in drawing the differences between, he talks about 7 different types of classes, but including, 3 types of precariats, I guess, the precariat class being constituted by 3 different types of people, depending on how they ended being precarious. But some of his critics point out that there is nothing that unifies these different types of precarious, that how can we imagine any kind of collective cohesive struggle given the very different experiences and different backgrounds of the 3 different subclasses that make the precariat, which I don't know if it was in my I think it was in one of my slides. He calls them the atavists, the progressives, and the nostalgics. The atavists are basically people that have used to be part of the working class, but now have fallen off. So they no longer have a past because they cannot reclaim that, historical identity of stable members of a easily definable class. And then the nostalgics, which he identifies basically with minorities and migrants, because no, these are the atavists. Sorry, I'm getting confused now. The minorities and the migrants who don't have a present because they've left their past, but they haven't really developed the present right now because they're kind of divided between the past and the present, between the previous country that they've left and the country that they're living now. And the progressives, which is a very strong term, I guess, for the 3rd class, which are the intellectuals, people who are very well educated, but finding themselves in precarious circumstances and working, jobs at below their qualifications. And so some people have criticized that distinction or that division between 3 different parts of the precariat, because there's nothing that, and those critics have actually done interviews with representatives of these 3 different subgroups that establish that there is no really way to identify or to connect with these, because their experiences are very different. So how can cinema imagine a form of collective struggle? Yeah, sorry.
No, thank you. Sorry, I thought you were done. Just very quickly, I'm grouping 2 questions which came from our fellows. So Sanya would like to know how the cinema of precarity engages the spectator in the context of the current populist overtaking of the precarity topic, and Caroline asks whether precarity movies are more criticized by the public than mainstream films are.
Criticized by the public, I don't know what she means by
how is the welcoming of these movies by the public?
Well, again, I'm not sure what she means by the public, because the public can include how are they received by the general audience, or how are they received by...
I think that's the idea, but...
Well, many of them, for example, have done well at festivals, like Ken Loach, for example, and also Stéphane Brisé, the French director who did the work trilogy, The Measure of a Man, Another World, and At War. So they won, at the Cannes Film Festival, The Measure of a Man won several years ago, the grand prize, and the other one by Ken Loach also won. They're very well received on the international film festival circuit, but the problem, of course, is that they're not very well in Europe. I guess they're better well distributed in movie cinemas. The general public can go and see them. But in North America, for example, it was impossible to see these films. You have to go to special libraries or special, author cinemas to see them. And I don't know what to say about their reception, other than they've done very well at the film festival. They've been received multiple awards. And the other one, I'm not sure, the populist, I'm
It's
not sure.
the attitude towards populism and the populist undertaking of the precarity topic.
Well, I'm not sure what Sonny means by the populist overtaking of the precarity topic. I'm not sure what she means by that. So maybe she can clarify. But on the other hand, I also have only 1 minute left because I have to go to a departmental meeting. But if any of you have any questions, feel free to email me and I can email you, I can answer these questions as much as I can.
Thank you very much, Temenuga. I just would like to tell everybody that we will make all the lectures, presentations available on our channels, on our website. So even for those of you who would like to take notes of some movies, you will have the occasion to do that. And I would like also to thank Temenuga for her presentation, to thank you all for the terrific questions, and to remind you that next week we will have the fourth fellow presentation. Caroline Irshara will talk about gender bias, language and medicine, findings from a linguistic analysis of German radiology reports. So I hope we will meet you all next week, and I really thank you for your time and for your attention.
Thank you.